All right, I'm Matthew Adler from Duke University. Many thanks to the organizers of this terrific conference for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about equity, Pigou-Dalton, and Pareto. Some of those words may be unfamiliar, but I will explain them as we go along. All right, just to give an overview of the talk, this talk is about methodology. There are many people at this conference who know more and have thought more about universal coverage than I have. I have written about the methodology, in particular the philosophical underpinnings of equity, so I'm going to talk about that. It turns out that they're not just various views of equity, but indeed a wide variety of equity metrics, right? Quantitative tools for evaluating policies in light of equity. I mean, that's good news and it's bad news. It's good news because it means that if we want to use a quantitative framework for assessing the imposition of universal coverage or a particular version of UC, we can do so, but we also have to decide which metric to use. So that's what I'm going to try to discuss. What methodology should we use for thinking about universal coverage or the inclusion of particular programs in a system of universal coverage? Now, what's interesting is that the Pigou-Dalton principle, I'll abbreviate it here as the PD principle, in some form is the heart of any equity metric. And we can say more, and I'll talk about this. Standard health equity metrics, there are, of course, as people here are aware, in the field of public health, global health, there are standard approaches that are used for assessing equity. Those actually satisfy this principle, this Pigou-Dalton principle, with respect to health. Now, that's arguably problematic, and again, we can discuss that and disagree about that, but arguably, to have a metric that uses health as the currency for equity, as opposed to well-being more generally, is a sort of second best. Well-being depends, of course, on health, but also on non-health attributes. And ideally, then, one would want to have an equity metric that satisfies this Pigou-Dalton principle with respect to well-being generally, as opposed to health. Moreover, as we'll talk about, standard health equity metrics can violate the Pareto principle. So the ideal, I want to suggest, would be an equity regarding social welfare function, and again I'll talk about that, applied to interpersonally comparable utility, where utility is a measure of well-being, all things considered, taking account of not just health, but also non-health attributes. But the end of the story thus far is not maybe so happy because, as I'll also discuss, constructing utility is not easy. All right, so that's an overview of what I'm going to cover. So let me talk about this Pigou-Dalton principle. The principle says that a non-leaky, gap-diminishing transfer in an appropriate currency, and again I'll talk about this, but this principle has different possible currencies, but whatever the currency, the PD principle in that currency says that a non-leaky, gap-diminishing transfer from someone with more of the item, the currency, to someone with less is an improvement. So this is just a schematic here, right? If these are 5 people and these are the holdings of whatever the currency is, might be income, might be health, might be utility, the PD principle says this is better. Now you'll note what's happened here is that we've taken this situation where the second person is 8, the third person has 16, and we've transferred 3. So this person has moved from 8 to 11, and this person has moved down from 16 to 13. Now that's not leaky, right? It's not as clear what happens if we, for example, reduce this person's holdings by 3 and improve this person's by only 2. That's more controversial. But PD says at a minimum, where we have a non-leaky transfer, right? Note also that the transfer here diminishes the gap. right? We've transferred 3. We haven't transferred so much as to increase the gap between these two. The gap has gone from 8 to 2, right? And what PD says is that that's an improvement. I like to think of this principle, the Pigou-Dalton Principle, as sort of Pareto. Now, of course, most people here know about the Pareto Principle. Pareto is about efficiency. I think of PD as sort of Pareto's twin, or Pareto's kinder, gentler cousin, right? Less well known, but just as Pareto is sort of a precise way to capture a concern for efficiency, so Pigou-Dalton is a precise way to capture a concern for equity, right? What Pareto says is that if everyone weakly prefers an outcome, if everyone either is indifferent between two outcomes or prefers one, that's weak preference, and some strictly prefer the outcome, then the outcome is better. If everyone's preference points one way, then that outcome is better. This, of course, is the core of economics and the core of a lot of quantitative methodology in economics. But this counterpart principle, PD, turns out to be the core of equity. Now, one important difference, and this also I think is interesting, is that the meaning of Pareto is pretty much set, right, as I just gave it. Certainly when economists talk about the Pareto principle, this is what they mean, right? Again, given a universal a pattern of preference in favor of one outcome, that outcome is better. By contrast, the Pigou-Dalton principle comes in many different versions. And I have an article coming out shortly, Equity by the Numbers, which will be on the SSRN paper website, which goes through this in great detail. I have a slide. I'm not going to go through all of this. This would take up a lot of time. But if you work through all these different metrics, these are different metrics for thinking about equity in some sense. So, of course, we have standard income inequality metrics, right? One sees all the time, articles or in the popular press, discussion of the degree of income inequality using something like the Gini coefficient, right? We also, all the time, have quantification of the degree of poverty. Has poverty gone up or down? It turns out, and I talk about this in detail in the paper, that those metrics satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle with respect to income. They have the feature that a transfer, a non-leaky transfer of income from someone who is better off to someone who is worse off, in the case of the income inequality metric, will decrease the degree of measured inequality. In the case of an income poverty metric, at least if this is a transfer below the poverty line or a transfer from someone above the poverty line to someone below, given typical or at least widely endorsed poverty metrics, will again decrease the measured degree of poverty. Now there's one difference here, and because this is not directly relevant to this talk, I'll just mention it. But this basic principle, the Pigou-Dalton principle, can also come in a restricted or unrestricted form. Right? The restricted version of the Pigou-Dalton principle says there are only certain transfers, only as between people with certain characteristics is it the case that a PD transfer in the currency increases equity. In the case of income poverty metrics, as opposed to income inequality metrics, there is this kind of restriction, and that occurs because of this poverty line. Right? Any poverty metric brings into play the poverty line and in effect looks at how people are doing, what fraction of the population is below the poverty line and how they're doing. Poverty metrics are insensitive to transfers above the poverty line. If the poverty line is, let's say, $30,000 a year, whatever it might be, and government effectuates a PD transfer from someone with an income of $100,000 to someone with an income of $50,000, that is not going to affect the degree of poverty. It will affect the degree of inequality, but not the degree of poverty. So one way to think, I think generally, and this is what this article tries to do, about all these metrics for equity is in what currency is the PD principle being satisfied, and is the metric such that it satisfies this PD principle only in a restricted way or in a more unrestricted way. Health, this is what I'll talk about in a second, but this, a family of fairly standard, at least in health scholarship, metrics. So using an inequality metric, but now to look at the population distribution of health. QALY-based cost-effectiveness analysis with equity weights, and the so-called concentration index, as I'll talk about in the next slide. These also satisfy this basic principle of equity, but they do so using the currency of health as opposed to income or something else. And as I'll explain in a moment, this concentration index also embodies a kind of restriction. Only certain PD satisfying health transfers are going to be seen as increasing equity. I also talk at the end of the talk, my preferred evaluation methodology involves so-called social welfare functions, where the currency is not health, it's not income, it's utility, this measure of well-being, all things considered. These, actually not all of them, not the utilitarian social welfare function, but what might be called equity regarding social welfare functions, and there are a lot of different kinds of those, will satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle with respect to utility. These don't constrain the scope of that principle. And then finally, I'm not going to talk about these here, but there are, this is really sort of a cutting-edge area of scholarship on equity, so-called multidimensional, either inequality metrics or poverty metrics, that look to how people fare on multiple dimensions. But unlike social welfare functions, which try to integrate all those dimensions into a single measure of utility, these sort of look at these multiple dimensions separately, and actually, if you look at them closely, will satisfy this Pigou-Dalton principle dimension by dimension. So that, I'll note that. I'm not going to talk about that here. But this is just to show how widespread this principle is. Okay, so let me just explain a little more now how these different health equity frameworks satisfy this Pigou-Dalton principle. One way to think about health equity is just to take one of these standard inequality metrics. These are standard metrics originating, and first used to measure the inequality of income, the Gini coefficient, the coefficient of variation, a so-called TIO index, so-called Atkinson inequality measure. These have different properties, but all of them, they have this common core. All of them satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle. Every standard inequality metric has a feature that if you, again, have a non-leaky transfer, a pure transfer, diminishing the gap between someone with more and someone with less, that decreases the degree of measured inequality. So obviously, if you're applying this to the population distribution of health, measured in some way, whether that be, longevity or QALY or what have you, then that approach is going to satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle in terms of health. What about QALY-based cost-effectiveness analysis? Now, again, I'm not a public health expert, but I take it, at least in the literature, there has been talk of doing that with equity weights, right, where the effectiveness measure gives different weights to health gains for people of different kinds. One way to do that, probably the most straightforward way to do that, is just to give greater weights to people who are in worse health. So what that says is that a given QALY change will be given a greater weight if that change benefits someone who's at a lower QALY level. Right, so one approach to QALY-based cost-effectiveness analysis with equity weighting, that obviously will satisfy this Pigou-Dalton principle in health. A way to think about that is, let's imagine we are choosing between two programs with the very same costs, right? So costs are not a factor, right? But we can only choose one or the other. And the programs have the very same QALY gain. So program P will increase health by some amount delta QALY, and P star will increase health by the very same amount delta QALY. But it turns out that P star delivers this gain to someone who's at a lower QALY level, while P delivers it to someone at a higher QALY level. Ordinary QALY cost-effectiveness analysis will be indifferent. Same cost, same effectiveness. But if we're doing this equity weighting, we're going to choose P star, and that in turn is just a kind of Pigou-Dalton transfer. By choosing P star as opposed to P, in effect, we're transferring that delta QALY from someone who is better off to someone who is worse off. Similarly, this health concentration index, I'll give a picture in a second. This, I think, is actually maybe more used than the others. There's an interesting debate. People, at this conference will know more about this than I, but between this debate about how inequality with respect to health should be measured, should it be measured on this kind of population basis, just applying one of these income inequality metrics to the population, or should the concern rather be about socioeconomic or social status skews in health? That is, should the concern rather be whether health, whether poor health is associated with being in a lower status social group? This so-called health concentration index is probably the most systematic way to look at that, at the kind of social gradient in health, and it turns out to satisfy the PD principle in a restricted form. So here's the concentration index. What this does basically is to say we're going to array groups along the x-axis in terms of social status. And social status can be measured different ways. These might be racial groups. These might be SES, socioeconomic status group, as measured by income, or what have you. In any event, so this is an example in which there are three groups. There's G1, the lowest status group, and 25% of the population is in that group. Then there's G2, which is the next 55% of the population, so cumulative population 80%. And then the final group, G3, which is the highest status group, which is the remaining 20% of the population. So those are the groups in ascending order of social status arrayed along the x-axis. Along the y-axis is the cumulative percentage of population health, however measured. So this might be lifetime QALYs, right, or whatever the measure of health is. So this says that these low status folks, although comprising 25% of the population, have only 5% of total health. They live shorter lives, they're in worse health state, what have you. The next 55% have 45% of population health, so their cumulative fraction is 50%. And finally, this high status group is 50%. So what you can see here is that the more the skew in health towards higher status folks, the more this is dragged down. Right? The concentration index is basically this area. So if this is 1 and this is 1, that would be a half times 2. A maximally skewed distribution has a concentration index of 1. Actually, it could go the other way. It's possible that health is more concentrated in people who are lower status, and that would bring the concentration index to the lower bound, which is -1. So it ranges from 1 to -1. Right? Again, 1 is bad, more concentration in health in those with higher social status. Now, what's really interesting, though, this is the Pigou-Dalton principle, is if you transfer health from someone at higher social status to someone at lower social status. So again, think of that as a choice of programs. One program will deliver a health benefit, on average to folks in a higher status group. A program will deliver that benefit to folks in a lower status group. That will decrease the degree of the concentration index, right? And I showed that with this formula down here, which I talk about in the paper. So there is this Pigou-Dalton feature, but there is this restriction. If you transfer health between people in the same social group, that does not affect the concentration index at all. So this is a critical difference than QALY-based CEA with equity weights or inequality metrics applied to health. It's only Pigou-Dalton transfers from members of higher social status groups to lower social status groups that are going to decrease the degree of concentration, that is the measured degree of inequity. All right. So what I've done thus far is to work through these various standard, at least for scholars, health equity metrics, and show how, in one or another way, they satisfy this Pigou-Dalton principle as applied to health. Okay, now I'm going to put on my skeptical hat. which is to say, well, why should that be the currency? Right? Why focus? And again, what I'm saying here is, this is a long-standing debate between people who want to sort of separate out health and the distribution of health as a concern of equity, and folks who want to say, well, no, maybe we should look at well-being, all things considered. My view is that the best justification for the Pigou-Dalton Principle, and this, by the way, I have a book that works through a lot of these ideas about how one should distribute well-being, came out last year. The argument I'm making here is in Chapter 5 of the book. Seems to me that the best justification for the Pigou-Dalton Principle is that someone who has lower well-being, right, whose life is worse, all things considered, right, who is less flourishing, has a stronger claim to a well-being improvement, right, at least modular responsibility. I mean, there is one concern out there in discussions of equity, which I'm not going to touch on here, which is that, well, someone might be worse off because they screwed up, right? Someone who is worse off than someone else might, in some sense, be responsible for that. Now, that affects any of these metrics. That could be true for health. It could be true for well-being. Let me just place that to one side. We do have techniques that are emerging for dealing with that systematically, but I'm going to ignore that. Washing out responsibility, right, it seems to me that, at least in principle, the appropriate currency for the Pigou-Dalton Principle should be well-being, because it's the person who's at lower well-being through no fault of their own who has a stronger claim to a well-being improvement. And again, what Pigou-Dalton says is if we have a pure transfer. In the case of a leaky transfer, where we improve someone who is at lower welfare by some amount at a larger well-being cost to someone who's better off, at that point maybe we need to balance equity and efficiency. But here we're talking about a pure transfer. Right? So overall welfare is a wash. In that case, it seems to me, the claim of the person who is worse off to the improvement is very compelling. But in any event, the point I want to make here is that the more natural, at least in principle, currency for the PD axiom would seem to be well-being. Now, it's true, obviously, as a general matter, poor health does correlate with poor well-being. People who are at poor health also tend to be at a lower income level, to have worse exposure in terms of environmental quality and so forth. But that correlation is not perfect. Right? It's perfectly possible for someone to be at high income but have bad health, and for someone to be at low income and be in good health. And indeed, if we're thinking about well-being, we should think not just about health and income, but the panoply of attributes that give rise to well-being. Income, leisure, social life, status, environmental quality, sort of subjective happiness, right? And the worry here in terms of these metrics that apply the PD principle to health is that someone who is the beneficiary at the lower health level may not be at a lower well-being level. Another worry is that a transfer in health which is non-leaky might be leaking well-being. Right? It is possible this goes to sort of the marginal impact of health on well-being. But if health, for some reason, has a higher impact on well-being at a higher level of these other attributes, a transfer which is non-leaky in health might actually be leaky in terms of well-being. And finally, and this is what I'll talk about, so these concerns here are sort of a general concern that, at least in principle, the currency for justice, or more precisely, the currency for the PD principle should be well-being. A more specific worry here is that these health equity metrics, all these metrics, can violate the Pareto principle. All right, so let me talk about that. Now, you might say, often when I talk about this, when people say, well, this approach can violate the Pareto principle, the response is, well, that's a theoretical point. In practice, right, the Pareto principle talks about a choice between outcomes or programs where everyone prefers one outcome or one program. And the response is, well, that's just theoretical. That never happens, right? In practice, we're always making choices where some prefer one outcome and some prefer the other. Still, right, it seems like, the fact that an approach might violate the Pareto principle is kind of a structural flaw. In thinking axiomatically about which framework we should use, this seems to be a problem. right? So it's something that might, tip the balance and should be added to the calculus in terms of our thinking about the frameworks. All right, so I'll just to illustrate this in terms of one of these health equity metrics, a quality-based cost-effectiveness analysis. This shows how, at least in principle, that can violate the Pareto principle, right? So, imagining we got two different programs. Again, let's imagine a choice of programs. This is, we can think of these as programs which will be paid for, at least to some extent, by the beneficiaries. So program Q star benefits this person who's at higher income. So by going from Q to Q star, her income goes from $300,000 to $200,000, and her health goes up. Think of this as sort of, annual income and health, either ongoing or for 1 year. This program benefits the person who is at lower income. Her health goes up if we choose program Q, and her income goes down. But what happens if we think about this in terms of their preferences? To encapsulate that, let's assume that they have a utility function that is a measure of their preferences of a very simple form. An additive, people sometimes talk about utility as being a function of both health and income. Here I have it being a function of health and log income to capture diminishing marginal utility of income, right? And we talk about this calibration. But this is actually a utility function which expresses kind of a strong preference for health. If you use this very simple utility function, it turns out that both of the individuals prefer this program. Basically what's going on is that because this person is higher in terms of income, income has less of an effect on her utility, and so she is willing to pay $100,000 a year for this health improvement. Income has a bigger effect on this person's utility, and so she would be better off with more money and less health. So they're both better off, right? The utility numbers are higher here, right? This is a possible scenario, maybe just a theoretical point, but a possible scenario. But what's interesting here is that, well, this is better, right? As a matter of the Pareto principle, the quality approach says this is better. Now, why is that? If you think of this in terms of cost-effectiveness analysis, right, the effectiveness of moving here is 0, right? There's no change in health, right? We gain 0.05 here, and we lose 0.05. So the denominator of the CE ratio is 0, right? And there's a cost. We lose $100,000 here, right? And we only gain $40,000. So 60,000 divided by 0 is infinity. There's an infinite, whatever the threshold. Again, there's a disagreement here, in public health about what the CE threshold should be here. But whatever that threshold, and for that matter, whatever kind of equity weighting we use, QALY approach is going to say that we should do this, and the Pareto principle says we should do this. And this, again, I've used this example. It's a very simple example using a very simple utility function. We can construct this kind of example for any utility function. What is happening here is that these individuals have heterogeneous trade-off rates between health and income, and that allows us to construct an example where the QALY cost-effectiveness approach, with or without equity weights, says one program is better, but both individuals would prefer the other program. Now, again, maybe a theoretical point, but it shows a structural issue. I'm not going to go through examples with the other approaches, but that is inequality metrics applied to health or the concentration index. But there, too, we can construct violations of the Pareto principle. Indeed, after I put together these slides, it occurred to me that there's a very simple example of that. And I'm sure this was discussed yesterday and will be discussed more today, right? Imagine a program of universal coverage where people are required to purchase some health service they would prefer not to buy, given their income, right? They would actually prefer not to spend the money on that health program, but it's part of the program. That is going to generate a case where inequality of health decreases. If these are lower income people, right, their health is going to go up. That's going to mean lower health inequality. If they're lower SES status or lower social status, again, that will decrease the degree of health concentration, but it'll be Pareto inefficient because they're worse off. So it's actually not an artificial point. All right. So in any event, so we've talked about these health equity metrics. We've talked about how, at least in principle, all of them can violate the Pareto principle, and more generally how one might worry about the fact that they use health, in particular, as opposed to well-being more generally, as the framework or the currency for measuring equity. All right, let me talk now about this other approach, which I like better, but again, my bottom line here is going to be that there are difficulties, too, in fleshing out this approach. And this is what I spent, this whole book talking about, this idea of the social welfare function, originating in theoretical welfare economics, used to some extent by scholars. Interestingly, it turns out that this approach is the dominant approach for thinking about optimal policies for climate change. Right, a different area, but if you were to go look at, for example, the now famous Stern report, or the work by William Nordhaus, or others on climate policies, this is the approach that they use. So it does, in fact, have some practical application right now. All right, so what does this approach say? It centers around this idea of utility, a measure of well-being. It says we're going to take outcomes. Now, again, for the moment here, I'm talking about outcomes, sort of so imagining that we're washing out uncertainty. I'll get to uncertainty at the end of the talk. But at least thinking, without uncertainty in the picture to begin with, and just ranking sort of final consequences. What the approach says is that we're going to take a utility function where UI, the utility of individual I in outcome X, a measure of I's well-being in X, which is in principle a function of all of that person's attributes in X, so both the person's health but also income and so forth. So we're going to convert these outcomes, that is descriptions of different attributes that people might have, into these lists of utilities measuring their well-being, and then we're going to have some rule for ranking these utility vectors. So how does this relate to the Pareto principle on the one hand and the Pigou-Dalton principle on the other? I mean, one possibility, a kind of ideal, is that this utility function here, this measure of well-being, should be preference respecting. That is, let me just back up here. I mean, part of what this utility function does is to make interpersonal comparisons. Right? If, for example, we observe that U1X is less than U2Y, that's supposed to signal the fact that individual 1 in outcome X is worse off than individual 2 in outcome Y. But it also, of course, makes intrapersonal comparisons. Right? It compares U1X to U1Y. And if U1X is less than U1Y, that says that intrapersonally for individual 1, she is worse off in X than Y. So one of the things that would be nice about this utility function would be that it be preference respecting. That is to say that for any given individual I, that the utility of individual I in X is greater than the utility of individual I in Y if and only if I actually prefers X to Y. And similarly, that those utilities should be the same just in case the individual is indifferent. Right? So a nice thing would be to have this utility function track each individual's preferences in the intrapersonal case. And here's the connection to Pareto. Let's assume, now I'm going to say at the end that this is not an easy thing to do, but let's assume we can construct a utility function which both makes these interpersonal comparisons and is preference respecting in the sense I just described. If this rule W for comparing utility vectors is increasing in each individual's health, right? What does that mean? That means that if this goes up mathematically, if U2 goes up between X and Y, then ceteris paribus, and nothing else changes and W increases, right? If, and this is not hard to see, if U respects each person's preferences and mathematically this rule is increasing in each individual utility, then the rule will satisfy the Pareto principle. Right? If it turns out that everyone prefers one outcome and utility is preference respecting, then each person's utility will go up, and because W is increasing, W will favor that outcome. So we then have actually a lot of social welfare functions, not utilitarian. The utilitarian social welfare function is Paretian, but it doesn't satisfy the PD principle. But it turns out that we have a bunch of a continuous prioritarian social welfare function and a Lexa-min social welfare function, all of which will satisfy the Pareto principle, at least if we can construct this preference-respecting utility function and satisfy the Pigou-Dalton principle. Right, so I've got a chart here. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to show the basic idea, we can ask first, this is the universe of social welfare functions that are increasing. That'll satisfy the Pareto principle if utility is preference respecting. And then we can then ask, does the social welfare function satisfy Pigou-Dalton? Utilitarianism doesn't. Right? For the utilitarian social welfare function, if we transfer utility from someone who is at a higher utility level to someone who's at a lower level, that's just a wash, because we're just adding up utilities. But it turns out there are a bunch of other social welfare functions which differ in their other axiomatic properties, but all of which are on the yes branch here. So that's true of this rank-weighted social welfare function. It's true of Lexa-min, which basically gives, says, is the worst off utility here greater than the worst off utility here? If so, this is better. If they're equal, will look like the second worst off, and so forth. And it's true, finally, of this continuous prioritarian social welfare function. That's something that other people on this panel will be talking about. But what this continuous prioritarian social welfare function does is to sum utilities transformed by a concave function, the effect of which is that, a utility increment has a bigger effect lower down than higher up. But again, the more important picture here, because the concern here is really PD, everything in this space satisfies PD. So there are lots of ways, if you like the social welfare function idea, to both satisfy Pareto and satisfy PD if, and this is a tricky part, and this really I think is where there's still a lot of room for scholarly progress and a lot of uncertainty in this social welfare function framework. Again, the idea here is to have a utility function that's going to, at the level of each person, take account of all of her attributes, health, as income, as well as other non-health attributes, and map those onto a utility level, measuring her well-being. But how should we do that? And in particular, how should we do that if people have different preferences? This is the real trick, right? If these are different bundles, right, it's possible that, for example, a particular bundle of health and income, Jim prefers this bundle as opposed to that bundle. Sue's got a different preference. So how are we going to come up with utility? This is something where the literature is still really uncertain, and I'm not going to talk about this at length, but this, it seems to me, is, I don't want to say the Achilles heel, but the unfinished part of this social welfare function idea. The part that really needs to be filled in before this can become a genuine competitor. One possibility is just to pool their preferences. Is to do the analysis using both Jim's utility function and Sue's utility function. The problem there is that if there are lots of different kinds of preferences, if preferences are sort of massively heterogeneous, then there's a lot of gappiness in the approach. Another possibility, which goes, originates in work by the great economist, game theorist, and Nobel Prize winner John Harsanyi, is this idea of extended or higher order preferences. The idea is that we might have kind of higher order preferences, not just preferences over bundles of attributes, but indeed preferences over combinations of attribute bundles and first order preferences. That is, you sort of say to yourself, well, would I prefer to have those health attributes, those income attributes, and those preferences, as opposed to having those health attributes, those income attributes, and those other preferences. All right, and that's kind of the problem is this is kind of unobservable. I mean, maybe you'd get at these through survey work, but a lot of that would have to be done. So it's a kind of a theoretical construct, but we don't have much evidence of this. Mark Flerbet on this panel has proposed a different idea, which is that of equivalent income. The idea here is that we take some reference set of non-income attributes. So, for example, a reference level of health, maybe perfect health, and similarly a reference level for other non-income attributes. And then, for any given bundle of attributes someone might have, we assign them an equivalent income, meaning the amount of income such that bundled with the reference attributes, they would be in difference between that and their actual bundle. So it's a way to normalize income to take account of non-income attributes, and then we might just use this as being the measure of well-being. All right, let me wrap up here. But just to make one other note about the Pareto principle, and this is, I think, quite important in talking about UC, but more generally about this approach. The approach I've been endorsing, or at least the ideal towards which those in this literature are working, is to have a social welfare function combined with this interpersonally comparable utility function that respects preferences, where the social welfare function is both increasing in utility, thus satisfies the Pareto principle, and like this rank-weighted or Lexamin or continuous prioritarian social welfare function, satisfies the Pigou principle. That's going to satisfy the Pareto principle at the level of outcomes, but it may not satisfy the ex-ante Pareto principle. Right? And the significance of this observation for UC is that health insurance choices, right? So let's imagine you think, hey, because again, obviously UC, it's not simply providing health benefits ex post for people who have a certain health condition, but in effect generally requiring people to insure against, under uncertainty against health conditions. So it's possible to have one program, a program of health insurance, which everyone prefers, ex ante, but that might, using this SWF approach, be seen as a bad thing. So here's an example. Let's imagine that this is the status quo, and this is the policy. Now what you can observe here is that there's a risk with the status quo. These are different states, state A or state B. The world might turn out to be this way. If that's the case, then Jim's going to end up in bad health and June's going to end up in good health, right? Or their positions might be flipped. This is a world in which we're sure that everyone's going to realize a level 50 minus epsilon, but slightly below the average here. But the risk of ending up at a bad level has sort of gone away. Now, what's interesting here is that if you use any of these PD-respecting social welfare functions, so continuous prioritarian, rank-weighted, Lexamin, all the ones in that space I illustrated earlier, they're all going to say that this outcome, an outcome of equality a little below the average here, is better than this outcome. Right? We've equalized and lost just a little bit, and so all these approaches are going to say this is better. Indeed, we can say, looking at this, that regardless of the state of the world, whether the true state of the world turns out to be A or B, right, this is going to be a better outcome. So we're going to be sure, if we're, Pigou-Dalton respecting, we can be sure that every possible outcome here, right, the only possible outcome is 50 minus epsilon for each, is better than every possible outcome here. And yet, as a matter of this ex-ante Pareto principle, right, each person's expected well-being, that actually turns out to be higher here. Right? In effect, each individual is willing to run the risk of being very badly off, but if one thinks in terms of outcomes, that's a risk that should not be run. All right, so let me stop there. And again, to sum up what's fundamentally a kind of a mixed message here, it seems to me that the theoretical ideal for thinking about equity, now this is very general. As I said earlier, this is used to think, for example, climate change, but certainly it can, in theory, be used to think about universal coverage, whether to have that at all or the particular form of that. So in theory, one could assess that using the expected value of the social welfare function. What kind of social welfare function? A social welfare function that respects the Pigou-Dalton Principle, and that's increasing in utilities. And the currency for that, again, is not health, but rather this more inclusive measure of well-being, a measure of well-being, utility, which tracks interpersonal comparisons, but intrapersonally respects individuals' preferences, right? And as I say here, we're not there yet, and I think the real trick is coming up with this utility function. Economists, certainly economists 50 years, 60 years ago, like to say that interpersonal comparisons were impossible. I don't think that's right, but it is difficult to come up with an interpersonally comparable measure of utility, for this context as a function of health and non-health attributes, which has all the features that we might like. Thank you very much.